The leather on the Biedermeier chair felt cool and smooth under my hands. Across the polished mahogany table, my father's lawyer looked pale. His confidence was gone. He kept glancing at the small, yellowed piece of paper under the glass weight in the center of the table. I didn't know then that a single sheet of old paper could dismantle an empire. I only knew it was the beginning. But that moment came much later. The story began 6 months earlier, in the quietest room in the city. The only sounds were the soft whisk of my brush and the low hum of the dehumidifier. In the late afternoon light, dust motes danced in the air, each a tiny, silent star. My hands were steady. I brushed away a century of grime from the spine of a book bound in crumbling calfskin. This was my world. Here, in the climate-controlled silence of the museum's restoration room, I was in control. Surrounded by the dead, I could finally breathe. This was the man none of them ever saw. I parked my Honda down the street from the house. It was a modest car, practical and quiet. Just like me. I adjusted my tie in the rearview mirror, the silk not feeling too tight. It was a gift from my mother. A cage for my throat. I took one deep, fortifying breath before getting out. I was putting on my armor. The house was a pristine Tudor, impossibly large on its manicured lawn. It didn't look like a home. It felt like a monument to their success. Inside, the party was a symphony of polite laughter and tinkling glasses. I found my cousin Mark holding court by the fireplace. He was telling some story, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who had never failed. I tried to start a conversation about a recent exhibit on cartography, a topic I knew well. For a moment, he seemed engaged. I didn't realize at the time, but that brief, genuine interest would eventually cost his private equity firm over $30 million. Then my mother appeared. Eleanor glided to his side, placing a delicate hand on his arm. "Mark, darling, you must tell everyone about your trip to Verbier," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "Alex, your cousin is doing such incredible things." She steered him away as if he were a ship and she were the rudder. The conversation turned to ski chalets and stock options. I was left in his wake, an island in a sea of champagne. I drifted away from the noise. I found myself in front of a glass cabinet in the study. Inside, my father's collection of antique clocks ticked in perfect, asynchronous harmony. I lost myself in the gleaming brass and intricate gears. It was a small comfort. My father, Richard, appeared at my elbow. He wasn't there for me. He was performing for a guest standing nearby. "Each one tells a story," Richard said, polishing the glass with a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket. "Precision, ambition, legacy. Things that last." He glanced at me, his eyes holding a familiar mix of pity and disappointment. "Your museum work is so stable, Alex. It's good to have that kind of security." The words were a compliment. They landed like a blow. That Jaeger-LeCoultre Atmos he was polishing, the one that ran on air, it would later sit on an evidence table in a federal courthouse. Dinner was on the main stage. The dining room table gleamed, set with silver so polished I could see my distorted reflection in the back of a spoon. The conversation was a carefully orchestrated performance, led by my parents. They praised Mark's new promotion at a tech firm. They lauded his ambition. "That firm is shaping the future, Mark," Eleanor said. "It must be thrilling to be a part of something that matters." "It takes courage to take risks," Richard added, looking pointedly in my direction. "That's how you build a real legacy." I said nothing. I focused on my plate. I cut my roasted lamb into meticulously small, perfectly even pieces. I was creating order in the only place I could. The scrape of my knife against the porcelain sounded unnaturally loud in my ears. I felt their eyes on me, the weight of their judgment a physical force. My shoulders hunched. I glanced up once, just for a second. I saw the familiar look on their faces and let the deep, old hurt wash over me. Then my placid, agreeable mask slipped perfectly back into place. My mother smiled her practiced, reassuring smile. Years later, during her deposition, she would use that exact same expression. It didn't work then, either. My apartment was my refuge. It was the polar opposite of their house, cluttered with books and historical maps, but organized in a way only I understood. The air smelled of old paper and leather conditioner. The sounds of the party, the ghost tones of their voices, still echoed in my head. I stood in the center of the living room and loosened my tie, undoing the knot their world had tightened around my neck. I walked to a shelf of old books I had collected, my own small, worthless archive. I ran my fingers along their spines, feeling the texture of the worn leather. I took out a soft cloth and a bottle of conditioner and began to carefully, methodically treat the cover of one of the books. It was a silent, meditative ritual. I wasn't just fixing the book. I was fixing myself. The energy finally left me. I slumped into my worn armchair. For the first time, I saw the room through their eyes. Not a curated collection, but a room full of old, secondhand things. A failures museum. My eyes landed on a small stack of items on the side table. Things my parents had given me from my grandfather's estate. The things they had deemed not valuable enough for their own collection. On top was a dry, academic book on Renaissance art with a faded, unremarkable cover. I picked it up. Its weight in my hands felt symbolic. This was the life they saw for me. Stable. Secure. Second-rate. That book, their cast-off, eventually became the map. It led to everything. Holding it then, a tangible piece of their casual disregard. The full, crushing weight of my own inadequacy washed over me. It was a moment of quiet, absolute defeat. Lost in the silence, I idly thumbed through the brittle pages. It was a mindless, empty gesture. My thumb caught a page near the back. A small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and stiff with age, slipped from between the page and the binding. It fluttered down and landed silently in my lap. I stared at it. It was clearly old, an alien object inside this forgotten book. My breath caught in my throat. The weary resignation in my chest evaporated, replaced by a flicker of profound confusion. Then came a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Pure, unadulterated curiosity. My hand moved towards the paper, my fingers hesitating just an inch above it. The only light came from my desk lamp, a small yellow circle in the vast darkness of my apartment. My hands trembled, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, as I unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, and the sound it made was crisp and loud in the absolute silence. I read the words, my lips moving without a sound. A bank name I didn't recognize. An account number. And the last sentence, the one that stopped my heart. Don't let them bury the truth with me. I read it again. The exhaustion from dinner was gone, burned away by a wide-eyed, breathless shock. I looked around my quiet room, at the silent books and maps, and then back at the letter. This single piece of paper had just ignited my entire world. The next day at the museum, everything was different. I waited until my colleagues left, until the main lights dimmed and the halls were filled with a reverent hush. Then I sat at my terminal and used my archivist login to access the restricted newspaper database. I used the same system I would later use to trace the network of shell corporations they thought was untraceable. But that night, I was only looking for a ghost. I typed in my grandfather's name, the name of the bank, old business addresses. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard was the only sound. It was the sound of a new life beginning. To make it real, I had to see the bank. It was a granite fortress downtown, called Sterling Trust. A name I'd never heard my father mention. I didn't go in. I sat in a generic coffee shop across the street, a place with bad coffee and cheap furniture. I ordered a black coffee and wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug, pretending to read a book on paper preservation. My eyes never left the bank's imposing marble entrance. I studied its columns and its bronze doors, committing every detail to memory as if it were a historical artifact. For the first time in my adult life, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I was on a mission. I was invisible, but now it was by choice. The phone call was the hardest part. I paced my apartment, a small notepad clutched in my hand. I had written a script. A false name, Mr. Peterson, an estate lawyer. I would use that name many more times, a name that would eventually appear on subpoenas that would make my father's hands shake. I mouthed the word silently, then picked up the phone. My voice was audibly shaky on the first attempt. I hung up before anyone answered. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and dialed again. When the operator answered, my voice was steady. It was a performance. I delivered my lines flawlessly, a perfect imitation of a confidence I did not feel. My mother called a few days later, asking me to pick up a box of my old childhood books from the basement of their antique shop. She'd found them and wanted them out of her way. The basement smelled of dust and turpentine. As I sifted through the box, my father came down the wooden stairs. He watched me for a moment, a patronizing smile on his face. Still collecting old things, I see. Some things never change. The subtext was a hammer blow. He then asked, "Your mother said you seemed a bit distracted lately. Everything all right at that museum of yours?" It was the same condescending question he'd asked me months later, in a sterile conference room right before I had him served. But this time, something was different. A flicker of defiance. I met his gaze. I didn't shrink. "Everything's fine, Dad. Just busy." The firmness in my tone was new. He noticed. It was a tiny shift in the gravity between us, but it was a shift. On the bus ride home, rain streaked down the window. I held one of my grandfather's old pocket watches, another piece of junk from the box of things they hadn't wanted. I wasn't examining it. I just held it, feeling the weight of the cool metal in my palm. I popped it open. The soft, rhythmic ticking was a steady, reassuring beat. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled. A real smile. I wasn't just the disappointing son. I was his grandfather's grandson. I was the keeper of a secret. That night, an email arrived. A secure link from the bank, a preliminary confirmation before they would release any official documents. I typed in the reference number from the letter. My fingers hovered over the enter key. A lifetime of being second best, of being a disappointment, made me hesitate. I clicked. A loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity. Then the screen refreshed. It was a simple, text-only statement summary. Account holder, Edward Alastair Hayes. And a balance. 01, followed by a comma, and then 6 more digits. The numbers on the screen were just the beginning, the first breadcrumb in a trail that led straight to a vault in Geneva. I leaned back in my chair and let out a sharp, audible gasp. It was real. A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but I was smiling. It was never about the money. It was the validation. My grandfather had seen me. He had trusted me. Buoyed by the discovery, I looked at the box of his things with new eyes. These weren't worthless objects. They were clues. I picked up the old art book where I'd found the letter, my archivist's instincts fully awake now. I ran my hand along the inside back cover and felt a slight ridge beneath the paper lining. I took a palette knife from my restoration kit and carefully worked it loose. Tucked inside was a small, black and white photograph I had never seen before. It was my grandfather, young and smiling, standing next to another man, his arms slung around the man's shoulder. They looked like brothers. That man in the photo, the one my grandfather called his ghost. It would take me 3 weeks and a trip to Zurich to learn his real name. I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in my grandfather's familiar handwriting were 2 words. My ghost. My triumph vanished, replaced by a profound and sudden confusion. This was supposed to be my secret. I now realized I had just found the edge of someone else's. The first light of dawn was filtering through the window, gray and thin. I hadn't slept. The apartment was a chaotic map of my obsession. Open books, scattered papers, the glow of the laptop screen. Propped against the sugar bowl on my kitchen table was the photograph. My grandfather and his ghost. I waited for the coffee to brew, the machine hissing in the quiet. I picked up the picture. The confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, energized determination. This wasn't a dead end. It was the next door to open. I called my mother later that morning. I kept my tone light, casual, the voice of the dutiful son she expected. "Mom, I was thinking about Grandpa lately," I said. "I'd love to borrow those old photo albums, maybe scan a few pictures for a digital archive." I weaponized my own harmlessness. The same harmlessness that would make them underestimate me until it was too late. I let the silence hang for a moment before I added. There was that one of him with a friend. They looked like real pals. I don't think I ever knew who that was. Her answer was smooth and immediate, a story of a short-lived business acquaintance, long forgotten. It was the same easy, practiced tone she would later use on the witness stand. It was a lie. I spent the next afternoon in the city's municipal archives. The room smelled of decaying paper and dust. I sat at a humming microfilm reader, the pale green light illuminating my face as I scrolled through decades-old business ledgers and property deeds. I wasn't looking for a name. I was looking for a shadow, an absence where a partner should have been. My gloved fingers traced the faded ink, cross-referencing dates from my grandfather's official company history with the city's records. I was in my element, using the meticulous skills they called stable to dismantle the very foundation of their lives. Back in my apartment, the investigation took over the wall. I pinned up index cards. On one side, in my neatest printing, grandfather's first import deal, Lion, 1978. Sells textile business, 1985. The official history. On the other side, my own findings, scrawled in a rushed, urgent hand. Shipping manifest. Florence, not Lion, 78. No record of textile business sale. In the center, I pinned the photograph of the ghost with a large, red question mark drawn beside it. The wall was a map of their lies. The confrontation came at a gallery reception. A sterile, white room filled with the clinking of wine glasses and the hushed tones of people admiring art they didn't understand. I found my father holding court by a twisted metal sculpture. He beamed when he saw me. "Dad?" I began, my voice even. I was looking into some of Grandpa's old business dealings for that archive project. I couldn't find any public record of his first big deal. The one in Lion? The smile on his face didn't fall. It froze. "That was a private deal, Alex," he said, his voice a little too smooth. "A handshake agreement. That's how men of his generation did things. With honor." I pushed. "It's just, the details are a little fuzzy." I was testing the lie. His eyes narrowed. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip just a little too tight, a gesture of paternal control that was really a warning. It was the first time I felt the cold beneath his polished surface, a cold I would come to know very well. "Some stories are best left as they are," he said, his voice low and firm. "Don't go digging where you don't belong." I felt the chill of that threat all the way back to my apartment. I needed to find the man I remembered, not the monster I was uncovering. I pulled out a small, scuffed wooden box containing his fountain pens. I picked one up and found the dried remnants of blue ink on the gold nib. I remembered watching his hand move across a page, the soft scratch of the pen. I dipped the nib in a new bottle of ink and, on a clean sheet of paper, tried to replicate his signature from the letter. My attempt was a clumsy failure. The distance between the man I thought I knew and this secret stranger felt vast and empty. I sat at my desk, my father's words echoing in my ears. "Don't go digging." The lie about the handshake deal in Lion felt too perfect, too rehearsed. I focused my search on that exact date in 1978. I dug into international travel records, passenger manifests, archives the public wasn't supposed to see. I found nothing under my grandfather's name. Then, a thought, cold and sharp, cut through the noise. I typed in my mother's name. A record appeared. A passenger manifest for a TWA flight from Rome to New York. The date was a perfect match. On the day my grandfather was supposedly shaking hands in Lion, my mother, Eleanor, was flying home from Italy. Alone. That document, that simple flight record, would become Exhibit A in the case against her. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The simple story of a secret inheritance was gone. This was a conspiracy. My mother was the one in Italy. My father was the one telling the lie. A desperate clarity took hold. I looked back at the photograph of my grandfather and the ghost. If they lied about everything else, they were lying about him. My archivist I took over. I scanned every millimeter of the photo with a magnifying glass. In the background, behind the two smiling men, was a brick building. Etched into the mortar of one brick, so faint it was almost invisible, was a symbol. A small, stylized painter's palette. I grabbed my grandfather's old art book, the one that started it all. I flipped to the index, not looking for a name, but for an artist whose mark was a palette. I found a minor reference to a Renaissance painter, Giovanni Bellini, who sometimes hid a small palette symbol in his work. My hands were shaking. I turned to my laptop and typed Giovanni Bellini and forgery into the search bar. The first result was a scanned newspaper article from 30 years ago. The headline read, "Master forger evades FBI, dubbed the Bellini ghost for his skill in replicating Renaissance masters." The world fell away. The room was silent. My grandfather wasn't a textile importer. He was a criminal, and the man in the photograph wasn't his partner. He was the artist who created the forgeries. He was the ghost. I was in the conservation lab, my sanctuary, looking at an ancient Roman vase under a magnifying lamp. But I wasn't seeing the cracks to be repaired. I was seeing the maker's mark, the faint imperfections, the story hidden beneath the glaze. Every object has a secret, I murmured to the empty room. A colleague walked past. "Talking to the pottery again, Alex?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet lab. I looked up and smiled, a small, confident expression that was entirely new. "Just listening," I said. My world of silent artifacts was no longer a retreat. It was a training ground. My first move was to visit the city's oldest private art library. It was a dusty, labyrinthine place run by a stern, elderly librarian named Ms. Pinter. I didn't approach her as a researcher. I approached her as a fellow historian. "I'm trying to trace the provenance of a few minor family heirlooms," I explained, showing her a list of objects my grandfather had acquired. She would later provide sworn testimony, her memory for auction lot numbers proving to be irrefutable. But that day, she simply peered at me over her spectacles, intrigued. "I'm looking for patterns," I said. "Auction houses, private sellers, anything from the late 70s. I was turning a technical search into a human collaboration. My apartment wall was no longer enough. I laid a large, old map of the city on my floor. Using the information from Ms. Pinter and a stack of old auction catalogs, I began placing pushpins on the map. Each pin marked a location where my grandfather had acquired an object: a silver snuff box from an estate sale in Beacon Hill, a rare book from a dealer in the North End. The pins seemed scattered, a random constellation of a rich man's hobbies. But my eye, trained to find order in chaos, sensed a logic I couldn't yet see. I took the problem outside. I sat on a bench in the public garden with a notebook, sketching the pattern of the pins from memory. I needed to see it from a different angle. I drew lines connecting the dots. It formed a rough, spiraling shape. It wasn't a word. It was a path. I was hiding my entire investigation in the mundane sight of a man doodling in a park. The encounter happened at the checkout line of a brightly lit, sterile grocery store. "Alex, what a surprise." My mother appeared behind me, her cart filled with artisanal cheese and expensive wine. The meeting felt entirely staged. Her smile was a perfect, polished thing, but her eyes were scanning me, assessing. "I haven't heard from you." "I was getting worried," she said, her voice dripping with a manufactured concern that would have fooled me a month ago. "You seem intense lately. Are you sleeping?" I kept my face a perfect, placid blank. The mask I had worn for 20 years. "Just a big project at the museum, Mom. Lots to think about." She placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. "Don't get lost in all that dust, dear," she said, her voice a soft purr. "Remember to come up for air." The line was a dismissal and a warning, delivered with the casual cruelty of a mother who believed she owned her son. That gentle touch was a threat, a silent promise of what would happen if I didn't stop. That night, the map was still a meaningless spiral on my floor. Her words had shaken me. I sat on the floor, staring at the pins. I picked up a framed photo from my desk, me as a boy, standing awkwardly beside my smiling grandfather, his hand on my shoulder. I was overwhelmed by the sheer insanity of it all. I was chasing a dead man's ghost, defying my own family. I spoke to the empty room, my voice barely a whisper. "What did you get me into?" It was the last flicker of the old Alex. The last moment of doubt. The spiral on the map wasn't random. It was a path. At its center was an old, private security bank on a quiet side street, the kind with a marble lobby and a reputation for absolute discretion. I walked to the counter, my heart a dull, heavy thud in my chest. I presented the original letter. The clerk examined it, then wordlessly retrieved a large, old-fashioned key and led me down a quiet hall to the vault. She used her key, then gestured for me to use mine. The small, strange key I had found hidden in the binding of my grandfather's fountain pen case. It had been the final pin on the map. It slid into the lock and turned with a solid, satisfying click. She left me alone in the small, silent room. I pulled open the heavy steel door. There was no cash, no gold bars. There were only two objects inside. The first was a thick, leather-bound ledger. The second was a painting, no bigger than a book, a landscape so exquisitely detailed it stole the air from my lungs. I opened the ledger. The pages were filled with my grandfather's elegant, precise handwriting. It was all there. Dates, buyers, chemical formulas for 17th century pigments, notes on aging canvas. This was the proof. This was the truth. For a full minute, I did not move. I just stood there, breathing in the smell of old paper and oil paint. The silence of the vault was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was right. Back in my apartment, the ledger sat on my desk like a bomb. But I wasn't looking at it. I had the small painting propped up under my desk lamp. I examined it with my archivist's loupe, marveling at the genius of the forgery. The deliberate, almost invisible craquelure. The masterful way the light hit the trees. I put the loupe down and stared at the painting. Then, I looked down at my own hands, resting on the desk. Steady, patient. The hands of a restorer, hands that found solace in meticulous, painstaking detail. A slow, shocking wave of recognition washed over me. I wasn't just looking at a painting. I was looking in a mirror. The very qualities my parents had dismissed as stable and unremarkable, my obsessive attention to detail, my patience, my ability to see what others missed, were staring back at me from that canvas. My grandfather hadn't just left me a secret. He had left me his soul. At my workstation in the archives, I had a page from my grandfather's ledger propped discreetly beside my monitor. I was cross-referencing the chemical formulas for his 17th-century pigments with the museum's restricted database on authentic paints from the same era. A colleague asked for help with a difficult provenance case. I glanced at the paperwork and immediately saw the flaw. The seller's stamp is post-war, I said, but the document is dated 1938. It's a fake. I delivered the line calmly. This was the new me, sharp, confident, and seeing the truth hidden beneath every surface. The first test was a phone call to my mother. She was telling me about a new acquisition for their shop. Instead of my usual passive hum of agreement, I asked a question. That 18th-century French secrétaire, did you check the joinery? A lot of reproductions from that period used the wrong kind of dovetail. The line went silent for a beat too long. When her voice returned, it was tight. Where did you learn about that, dear? My knowledge was no longer a hobby. It was a threat. A few days later, I showed up at their antique shop unannounced. I walked through the cluttered aisles, looking at the art not as a son, but as an expert. I stopped at a landscape painting hanging in a gilded frame. This is a lovely piece, I said to my father, who had been watching me from his desk. The brushwork is almost a perfect imitation of the Hudson River School. I emphasized the word imitation. My father's face stiffened. It's a period piece, he said, his voice dismissive. I held his gaze. Is it? I asked. I was no longer the boy who believed every story he was told. He felt it like a cold draft. The trap was sprung during a brief, tense dinner at their house. In a lull in the conversation, I looked directly at my mother. I was thinking about that trip you took to Italy, Mom. The one in the summer of '78. You never talk about it. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. My father's reaction was instant. What are you talking about, Alex? Your mother has never been to Italy. The lie was absolute, delivered with a cold fury that was meant to crush me. I didn't argue. I just looked at them, letting the silence hang in the air. I let them know that I knew. They summoned me to their home the next evening. I sat in an uncomfortable antique chair in their living room. Every polished surface, every priceless object, seemed to sit in judgment. They sat together on the sofa opposite me, a united front. The attack began not with anger, but with a deep, theatrical concern I would see them perform again for the police. Alex, darling, my mother began, her voice a soft caress. Your father and I are worried. This obsession with your grandfather. You're building fantasies, Richard said, leaning forward. Making connections that aren't there. We know you're grieving, son, but this is unhealthy. I tried to present the facts. The ledger, the bank account. They twisted everything. You always had such a vivid imagination, Eleanor said, a sad smile on her face. But you have to separate reality from fiction. A ledger? Alex, your grandfather was a businessman, not some character in a novel, my father said, his voice laced with pity. You're a quiet, sensitive person. The stress of your job, living alone, it can play tricks on your mind. They were relentless. They used my own personality, the very traits I was beginning to see as strengths, as proof of my instability. I walked in with the evidence of their crimes. I walked out feeling like a psychiatric patient. Back in my apartment, the silence was deafening. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked at my investigation on the wall. The map, the photos, the index cards connected by string. What had once been my command center now looked like the paranoid ramblings of a madman. I touched a string connecting two pushpins, and my hand was trembling. My confident purpose had curdled into a thick, suffocating shame. I was completely alone. I pulled the forged painting and the heavy leather ledger from their hiding place. This was my proof, my anchor. I opened the ledger and stared at my grandfather's meticulous, undeniable handwriting. "It's real," I whispered to the empty room. But my mother's voice was in my head. "You always had such a vivid imagination." My father's followed, separating reality from fiction. The doubt, so expertly planted, finally took root. I looked from the ledger to the perfect, beautiful painting. Was it a masterpiece of deception, or was I deceiving myself? In a single, crushing moment of defeat, I closed the ledger. The sound was a soft, final thud in the quiet room. I picked up both the ledger and the painting, walked to my closet, and placed them in a box at the very back. I piled old blankets on top of them. I was burying the truth. I was burying my grandfather all over again. I closed the door. My eyes were hollow. I had chosen their lie. I sat in my armchair in the near darkness. The apartment was tidy again. The wall was clear. The books were put away. It was the apartment of a quiet man living an unremarkable life. I had retreated. I had surrendered. Then a sound cut through the silence. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the wall that connected to the next apartment. A simple, 3-beat pattern. It stopped, then started again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I just listened, my expression a perfect blank. But as the tapping continued, a single muscle in my jaw twitched. It was a message. I didn't know who it was from. But in the absolute, desolate darkness of my defeat, something was trying to get in. I was frozen in the chair, listening to the silence. Then the sound started again. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the wall of the adjoining apartment, the rhythmic practice of my neighbor, a retired Morse code operator. I had always tuned it out as noise. But in the crushing quiet of my surrender, I heard it clearly. The pattern was SOS. It was just his habit, a meaningless echo. But the simple, desperate plea sparked a memory. I was a boy, watching my grandfather's hands repair a ship's chronometer, the tiny, precise clicks of the gears falling into place. He looked up and winked at me. "Everything has a system, Alex," he said. "You just have to be patient enough to find it." The memory faded. I looked down at my own hands, still and quiet in my lap. Slowly, I got up, walked to the closet, and opened the door. I reached into the back, under the blankets, and pulled out the ledger and the painting. The next morning, I went to the public library. A quiet table in the back, a neutral space far from the war zones of my life. I opened a clean notebook. I was no longer the victim of their lies. I was the curator. With the dispassionate detail of an archivist, I began to catalog their deceptions. Exhibit A, the handshake deal and lion. Narrative fabricated on date. Contradicted by Exhibit B, airline manifest. That simple spiral notebook would later be entered into evidence as Exhibit C, the methodical timeline of their fraud. I was turning their psychological warfare into a data set. I walked into an old-world art supply shop on a narrow side street, a place that smelled of turpentine and linseed oil. I showed the elderly shopkeeper a high-resolution photo of the forged painting. "I'm a conservation student," I lied, my voice perfectly smooth. "I'm trying to understand how a 17th-century master would have achieved this specific luminosity." I didn't ask if it was fake. I asked how it was made. I bought small, expensive vials of lapis lazuli and lead tin yellow. Back in my apartment, I didn't paint. I just mixed the pigments, feeling the gritty texture, understanding the material science of my grandfather's secret life. I scheduled a meeting with a semi-retired art history professor at the university. In her cluttered, book-filled office, I described the career of a hypothetical forger. Let's say a forger of this caliber was operating in the 70s and 80s, I posited. How would they have moved their product? Not for fame, but for profit. What kind of galleries? What kind of clientele? Professor Albright had no idea she was mapping out the very network that would lead to my father's indictment. Intrigued by the academic challenge, she laid out the entire system. They came for me at the museum. It was a power play, an attempt to corner me in my own territory. They appeared in the main gallery on a busy afternoon, wearing their signature concerned smiles. "Alex, we were in the neighborhood," my mother said. "We wanted to see you in your element." But I was different. I didn't shrink. I was the serene host in my own domain. I gave them a brief, professional tour of the new exhibit. When my father tried to probe, "You seem better. Have you put all that foolishness behind you?" I simply smiled. "I've just been focusing on my work," I said, my gaze sweeping over the perfectly preserved artifacts. It's amazing what you can learn when you stop looking for what you think should be there and just see what is. I wasn't talking about the exhibit. I was calm, detached, and unreadable. They left confused and, for the first time, truly unnerved. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out the original letter. I read the final line again. Don't let them bury the truth with me. I finally understood. It wasn't a plea for vengeance. It was a request for preservation. My grandfather, the brilliant artist who could never sign his own name, wanted the one person he trusted to be the archivist of his secret life. I looked from the letter to the painting, then to the meticulous archive of lies I had created. It was all one collection. His genius, their shame. It was my family's history. A profound sense of peace settled over me. The anger was now just a catalog entry in a much larger story. I stood before my rebuilt war room. It was no longer a mess of string and index cards. It was a perfectly organized, cross-referenced museum of their lives. On one side, a detailed analysis of my grandfather's forgery techniques, complete with pigment samples. On the other, the documented archive of my parents' deceptions. In the center, the ledger and the painting. A powerful realization washed over me. I hadn't just been investigating a crime. I had been curating a life. My unique skills, the quiet patience, the obsession with detail and provenance, were not a pale imitation of their ambition. They were a direct, undiluted inheritance of my grandfather's genius. He used these skills to create master fakes. I was using them to uncover an undeniable truth. I was not the stable archivist. I was the keeper of the entire, complicated legacy. The investigation was over. It was time for the presentation. I sat at my desk, calm and focused. I took all the materials from my wall and began to assemble them into a series of elegant, professional binders. I created labeled tabs and a table of contents. It was the work of a master archivist preparing an exhibition. I printed out a single title page. It slid from the printer, clean and sharp. It read, Provenance Report, The Miller Family Legacy, 1975, present. Curated by Alexander Miller. I placed the page carefully into the first binder. I closed it with a soft, final click. I was no longer reacting. I was ready to act. The museum was quiet just before opening, the air still and cool. I walked through the gallery of 18th century furniture, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. I was dressed in a simple, dark sweater. A curator, not a victim. I stopped at a small, exquisitely crafted writing desk, a piece my father had authenticated and sold to the museum years ago. I knew from the ledger that it was one of my grandfather's most perfect creations. I consulted my clipboard, then placed a small, professionally printed card on the velvet rope. It read, On loan. I looked at the empty space where the desk had stood. I wasn't stealing. I was reclaiming a piece of the collection. My apartment was clean, organized, and impersonal. A gallery. I called my mother. My voice was calm and level, an instrument I now controlled completely. Mom, I need you and Dad to come over tonight at 7. I've finished that family history project I was working on. It's time I showed it to you. It was not a request. When she started to make an excuse, a practiced dance of avoidance, I said simply, 7 o'clock, and hung up. The command was so alien to them. Their curiosity would be a leash. I made the final preparations. 2 simple chairs in the center of the room. Opposite them, on a long table draped in dark cloth, I placed 3 thick, black binders. They were perfectly aligned. Next to them, I placed the small, forged landscape. Finally, I positioned the antique writing desk to the side, its polished surface gleaming under a single, focused lamp. My home was no longer a refuge. It was a courtroom. Just before 7, I stood at my window and watched their Mercedes pull up to the curb. From my vantage point, they looked small. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not fear. Just a quiet, final stillness. I was the archivist, and my exhibit was about to open. They entered with an air of patronizing amusement. Alex, really, my father began, his voice booming with false confidence. What is all this drama? I didn't answer. I gestured to the 2 chairs. Please, sit. The silence unnerved them. They sat. I stood before the table like a lecturer about to begin. I've compiled a provenance report, I said, tapping the first binder. On the Miller family legacy. I opened the first binder. Inside were pristine copies of their public narrative, news clippings from their shop openings, Richard's business awards, the official history. I slid it across the table. This is the public exhibition. I opened the second binder. It was filled with my research. The airline manifests, the timeline of their lies, each deception cataloged and cross-referenced. This binder would become the core of the prosecution's case. This is the conservation report, I said, my voice flat, detailing the inconsistencies, the damage to the narrative. My father's face flushed with anger, but I was already opening the third binder. It contained the complete analysis of my grandfather's work. Pigment formulas, notes from the ledger. I placed the forged painting in the center of the table. And this, I said softly, is the secret collection. The works of the artist known as the Bellini Ghost. My mother let out a small, strangled sound. My father was frozen. His arrogance was gone, shattered and replaced by a pure, cold dread. The evidence, presented without emotion, left them no defense. The presentation was over. The room was utterly silent. My father, the patriarch, seemed to deflate. He slumped in his chair, looking at the binders, at the painting, at me. Utterly defeated. My mother was crying. Not her theatrical, manipulative tears, but the quiet, hopeless tears of a woman whose world had just turned to dust. In that moment, the curator vanished. I saw two frightened, flawed people who were my parents. The victory was absolute. And it was tragic. I asked the final question. My voice was still quiet. Why? Richard looked up, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was almost a physical weight. It wasn't about the money, Alex, he said, his voice a raw whisper. We never spent a dime of it. It's all still there. That was the first shock. Eleanor continued, her voice trembling. Your grandfather, that life? We were so ashamed. We lived in constant fear of being exposed, of the scandal destroying the respectable life we had built, the life we wanted for you. She looked at me, her expression pleading, desperate. We lied to protect you. We wanted you to be good and stable and safe. We just wanted you to be normal. I stared at them. I had prepared for greed. I had prepared for malice. I was not prepared for a twisted, suffocating act of love. They didn't lie because they thought I was worthless. They lied because they were terrified I would become my grandfather. Their lifelong campaign to diminish me wasn't born of contempt, but of fear. The crime wasn't greed. It was a tragedy of shame. They left, utterly broken. The decision of what to do was now mine. Expose them. Claim the money. Bury the truth again, this time forever. I was alone in my silent exhibit. The objects on the table were no longer just evidence. They were my inheritance. The money, the lies, the genius, the shame. I walked over to the forged landscape. I picked it up. My reflection stared back at me from the dark, varnished surface. I saw the quiet archivist, the meticulous investigator, and the grandson of a master forger. I had stepped out of their shadow, not as the stable man they tried to create, but as the true heir to a legacy of brilliance and deception. I had all the power, all the proof, and all the money. And I had the heaviest burden of all, a choice.